So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alison. I am a partner at Getz Fitzpatrick, where I focus my practice in trust and estates at the moment, but also commercial litigation, surrogates courts litigation, and I represent a lot of businesses in succession planning, as well as just managing their asset and asset protection, which is a part of trust and estates. And part of that is having policies and procedures in place. My partner is a corporate attorney, and we work with lots of businesses, including camps and other associations, to do that. And one thing that I've learned through this crisis is that it is a good time for businesses of all stripes to re-examine their existing policies and also deal with the COVID situation and what it presents. I am very invested in the camping community. I went to Camp Monroe for many years as a kid. My children are sleepaway campers, unfortunately not this year, so it's Camp Mom and Dad for the summer. But I definitely have an investment in the camp community, and it's a pleasure for me to be a part of it, even just being on the board of ACA. So when ACA said that they were doing this webinar series, I volunteered to see if I could give some insight from a legal standpoint to camps that may have questions, and so on. And so just by way of a disclaimer, this is not intended as legal advice. Everybody's situation is very different. You really have to consult with your own legal counsel for things that are particular to your situation and your organization. But I'm hopeful that what I've prepared today is going to give you some general guidance as to things you should be thinking about as we move forward into what is being called the new normal, although for lack of a better phrase, I'll use that. So I am going to share my screen, and I ask that you bear with me as I try to navigate this via Zoom. So I titled this "Putting Out Campfires Before They Start," because I think that the best way forward for everyone in the midst of this pandemic is having a plan. And it's a plan that I'm going to say this multiple times throughout the presentation, but it's a plan that you commit to in writing and that you communicate it frequently and often with your staff, so that everybody can be on the same page. And I'll show you throughout this why that is and why that's so important. So to begin with, the question is, to open or not to open. I understand that there's a diversity of camps and camp representatives on this call, some of whom may or may not have already made the decision to open or not, but I'm going to cover both situations, right? And so as I've dealt with camping clients and other related organizations, the first question is, can we open? Should we open? Do we want to open? And then, okay, how do we open? And so the first issue is deciding to reopen and what really goes into that. The first thing that I should note is that in entering into this, and I saw that a lot of camps were really struggling with this, and I struggle with this as a business owner myself, which is that the camp is not and cannot be an insurer of everything that might go wrong. And there's no responsible camp that's going to guarantee this, right? And so if you enter into the season saying, I have to guarantee that no kid on my premises is going to get COVID, that's not a reasonable standard, and that's not a standard that anybody is going to hold you to, because obviously the country couldn't guarantee that, the states couldn't guarantee that, and the issue is not whether you are going to prevent COVID from entering your camp shores. It's a question of whether you're doing everything that is reasonable and prudent as a camp owner to follow guidelines and to follow state regulations and prevent it as much as possible. And then if it does happen, it's what you're going to do afterwards, right? So within that lens and within that context is, what are the factors that go into deciding to reopen? And I am sure all of you have been agonizing over this, but I think it helps to just go back to the basics. So the first one is, what is your liability exposure and limitations on that? What are the CDC, and I should have put in the Department of Health guidelines. What are they requiring? And I know there's like a cheat sheet that I'm following myself for the office guidelines, but also for camps. What is mandatory and what is suggested? And it really, every time I go through it, I think of a different thing, but it really behooves everybody to go through it with a fine-tooth comb as far as what are those guidelines, and then the step forward of, can we implement this and how are we going to implement that? And that's something that I'm also dealing with. And that goes into, can you comply? And how do you break that down? Your staff training, your staff willingness, your staff monitoring, and what I would call the 80% rule, which is, this is not a rule, this is not a legal rule, this is just something I hold myself to, which is, if you're shooting for 100%, but if you have 80%, you're pretty good. That's not like the floor, but it's not going to go perfectly, right? And this is always an issue for camps. I know that you have issues with both recruiting staff and how are we going to get staff, and that's a bigger challenge even now in the time of COVID. International counselors are obviously hindered from coming in because of immigration restrictions, and so on. So those are all things that go into this. But this, and I've seen this with a lot of different businesses, including my own, and talking to a lot of teachers actually. We're all taking businesses that we've had decades of experience with, and this crisis has cast us back to square one as far as like just starting from the beginning. Teachers are redoing curriculums. Camps are having to redo their entire playbook. And in some ways, there's a silver lining to that, which is it forces us to re-examine our old policies and see if they're still working, COVID or no COVID. But it also makes us have to all of a sudden, under the gun, redo an entire manual for COVID and for staff training. Fortunately, the CDC and the state have given us a head start, and you can really pull from those materials so you don't have to recreate the wheel. But I think these things here are key, right? Yes, you're going to have with your key staff, or your full year-round employees, you're going to figure out what are your policies jumping off of the CDC guidelines. But the real key here is, how are you going to get everybody on the same page to understand those policies, to follow those policies, and to reinforce them? And among other things that I note on these guidelines is that, at least, I'm gonna cite to New York, although I know New Jersey has their own issuance, but more or less they're all the same or very similar, right? In terms of requiring face coverings. And I have seen this in lots of different contexts. People start to get lax if they're not reminded, if there aren't signs, if there aren't people saying, hey, put on your mask. And I think that's going to be true throughout the summer. The guidelines in New York are 10 campers in a cluster, and that cluster has to stay together and not interface with other clusters. And admittedly, it's difficult. I think it's possible, but it's going to take somebody really making sure that your staff is empowered to say to the 6-year-old who goes running across somebody in another cluster, no, you have to come back. And how, what are the icebreakers or the techniques that you're going to try and train them with scripts to do that so they feel comfortable enforcing it in still a fun and camp way. And I'm just kind of touching on some that stuck out to me of the guidelines that really were compelling. Dealing with indoor space and meals. In the guidelines, they were talking about having lunch boxes or having picnics. And what do you do on rainy days? I mean, I think these are some of the challenges that rise certainly to the top of what's happening. And also, and this is key, is the mandatory health screening. And I'm going to get into a little bit later in terms of bringing the parents in as partners in terms of certifying compliance, because in preparing for this, it struck me, and it's probably obvious that also doesn't get remarked upon. It's not just the camps that are responsible here, and particularly for day camps. I think also for resident camps, but for day camps in particular, you are sending them home at the end of the day. And the parents have to be a partner with you in minimizing the risk to the camp as a whole. And I'm going to talk about some suggestions I have that they're not requirements, but there are things that you might want to consider incorporating into your repertoire as you're doing this. One of these things is the mandatory health screening and the questionnaire, or the mandatory health screening assessments. I know for my firm, we are putting into place like a Google form that people can log in with every day. You might want to consider deploying technology so that you can do that, to have the parents of the campers filling that out on a daily basis, as onerous as it may seem, but really just doing a couple of clicks to confirm. They're not running a fever. They haven't been in contact with anybody in COVID. Nobody in the house is symptomatic. Keep it short, keep it sweet, but just keep it part of the repertoire. Another idea I had was having somebody on the bus, if you are using busing, with a clipboard that's logging it. But as I'll talk about later, I think these logs or having some sort of a record are important, right? When we go back to the key here, which is limiting your liability, limiting your exposure, you want to be showing and you want to be able to show that you have a business record, that you had a policy, you complied with the policy, beyond just saying it, but that you have logs from the various staff members doing what they're supposed to be doing. And just to circle back on the rest of this slide, I didn't put it on here, but the other piece of this is vendors. And I saw that in the guidelines, what they're talking about in terms of essential and non-essential vendors. You know, you have to dig a little bit deeper to see what are essential and non-essential, but certainly having pickup and delivery points outside of the camp, not letting them enter into camp, and similar precautions, right? Having them guarantee or certify that they have been wearing gloves and masks, that they're not symptomatic, that they are not in contact with anyone. And that's a situation that you're going to have to deal with your vendors. I'm focusing mainly in this presentation on campers and the parents, but if anybody has questions at the end about the vendors or things that you can do in terms of your contracts with them or putting certain protocols into place to get more comfort and to give them more comfort, we can talk about that as well. Okay, so when we talk about liability to camps, right, and I think about this in the context of a pre-COVID world as well as a post-COVID world, you are looking at what is your duty of care, right? When you talk about limitation of liability, you really don't want to get sued, right? We live in a world where you're going to get sued for negligence if something happens, or even if it's perceived to happen. And the standard to which you're held is your duty of care to campers. And a concept that's in loco parentis, right? You're standing in the place of a parent, and what would a prudent parent do in the situation when you are, you're not the caretaker of these kids, but they're in your custody and you have them for the day or for the summer. And again, it's not that you are going to prevent them or guarantee them from befalling harm, but you're taking reasonable steps. And again, have a policy, the policy's in writing, follow the policy. And that really, now more than ever, should be your mantra all summer long, right? What are your procedures? Are you having regular meetings would be one of my suggestions about this, of, with your staff and the different tiers of staff that you have a regular meeting, have and again, everybody's camp is different, everybody's business is different, but ideally you're gonna have a weekly in-depth roundup, right? And getting feedback from your staff. What's working, what's not working, what did you find challenging? Do adjustments need to be made to the policies? But also a morning huddle, right? Just to reinforce, what are your top 3 to 5 things, right? Making sure people are following it and making sure that you're addressing with staff I can't imagine in this environment that anybody's gonna be lackadaisical about it, but you never know. And making sure that you use that huddle to kind of reinforce it so they're starting out the day with that in their mind, and bringing that to the campers and everybody that they're dealing with. And the same, your usual employment issues still exist. This is just a layer on top of all of that, right? Your workers' comp if something happens to an employee, performance issues. If they're not complying with what the standard is in general with respect to the campers, you still have to be on top of that. This is just another layer of COVID compliance related performance issues if they're not complying. So in terms of the standard of care, sorry, I just want to make sure where I am on time. So you have your legal duty of care, right? And your duty is negligence claims, whether real or potential, it is depending on the circumstances and whether a duty exists, and the nature and the scope of that duty is ultimately determined by a court. So in terms of getting sued and having a judgment against you, you have to have a duty of care. If there's no duty of care, then you can't have the other requisite elements, which is a breach of that care and resulting damages, right? And that applies whether, a kid slips on the deck of the pool or they get bitten by, stung by a bee in the woods and they're allergic. And so it all depends on the various things that you have to worry about in general, right? Pool safety, campfire safety, all of those things. It's were you reasonable under the circumstances with respect to that activity. And you have an implicitly assumed obligation to protect the child from unreasonable harm when they come onto your campgrounds. But it doesn't require constant supervision or that you're guaranteeing that they're going to be free from harm, because there's an inherent risk in an outdoor or an adventure sport, right? If you're taking care to belay them in on the rock climbing wall, but they still fall, well, you've done everything that you're supposed to do and complied with regulations. And if you're ACA accredited, which you should be, complying with those accreditation standards, those are all things that help protect against liability, particularly accreditation, but also the local and state regulations. And so if there is an incident, and this is the same, like I said, for the bee sting or for COVID, your conduct is going to be measured in this way. Did the camp or the staff member act as a reasonable camp or staff member would have acted in the same or similar circumstances? So the test is reasonableness. It's not perfection, and it's not best practices. And the ACA website actually has a lot of really good literature on these topics that I'm touching on. So if you want to look at it a little bit more, go on the website, and I can share with you the link that I was looking at. And again, this recognizes that a prudent parent understands the inherent risks in sending a child to camp as part of the camp experience, and that there are things that can go wrong, right? So taking that as a backdrop, how does that apply to COVID? And I've taken a lot of time to think about this, both as a parent, as a board member, and as a lawyer, and in giving this presentation. So parents all over are dying to get their kids to camp, COVID or no COVID. And, there are people that have said, well, I'm reluctant, they're not going to send their kid, but the majority of anecdotal evidence I have are that parents are frustrated that their children will be at home this summer without the camp experience and what that means to them. That being said, once the child goes to camp and gets harmed, there's going to be a little bit of a different reaction, I am sure. And I think that the challenge here is that this is untested in the modern world. Of course, we had the Spanish flu in 1918. We had polio. From what I understand, in the time of polio, people still sent their children to camp, and that was an elixir to get them in fresh air. But here, that's not the situation. That's not the social situation. And what a reasonable and prudent camp owner would do, I think, is going to be uncharted territory, including what are other camps doing. The CDC guidelines help, the state guidelines help, and that certainly will give you, it's not just positive, but it will give you armor and protection if you are sued because somebody contracted COVID, leaving aside whether it was because of something that you did or did not do, or whether there was a contribution on the part of the child and the family. But again, compliance and documented compliance is going to help give you a shield and a cloak of saying, I did what I was supposed to do, this is unchartered, and this was reasonable. Okay, so I'm going to move on now. Now that we've talked about the duty of care and your liability, we go to insurance. So one of the first things that everybody should be doing in analyzing whether they're going to open is, what is your insurance portfolio say? What kind of lines of insurance do you have? If you have an insurance broker, which I'm sure most people do, start with the broker. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. And have the broker explain it to you of what is in the existing policy in terms of contraction of COVID. And there's a couple of different places to look for in your policies, right? You want to look for whether it excludes pandemic. Some policies do, some policies don't. And you want to see if it also excludes airborne chemicals or diseases, so that your commercial and general line is generally for bodily harm, personal injury, somebody trips and falls, a kid hits another kid. That's really going to be covered under the umbrella of your general commercial policy. And I think that's where you would really find pandemic as well as business interruption, but you might find it in the commercial line. Interestingly enough, on the environmental and chemical policies, which can be a part of the commercial line, but sometimes they're separate policies, that's where you're going to find things about airborne chemicals and diseases. And it's entirely possible that if you have this coverage, because for camps who own land, there is generally an environmental policy, or you might have an environmental policy to deal with Superfund sites or environmental contamination or water contamination. So that's another place to look if you have it, or to look into it with your broker. I'll come back to that in terms of renewal of your policies and whether there are other products in the marketplace that you may or may not want to purchase now going into the 2020 season or even beyond. And the third is business interruption insurance. Now, business interruption insurance is the kind that is most likely to have an exclusion about pandemic or some other sort of something else that relates to this. And so I'm sure those of you who had business interruption insurance looked at that previously, but if you haven't, or if you're not aware, just confirm with your broker whether or not you have it and whether it encompasses this situation. And that's important for those camps that are either delaying their opening, giving back partial refunds, or certainly for those businesses that are not able to open. Now, I'm not going to get into it too much, but there's other factors in terms of, are the states allowing you to open? Are they not allowing you to open? I know in New Jersey there was a proposed legislation. I don't think it's made its way through the legislature, but that they were going to compel insurance carriers to comply with business interruption policies. And I would invite you all to consider sending notice to your carriers of business interruption, of a notice of claim, even if it is explicitly excluded under the policy, or even if your broker tells you there's no point, because there might very well be legislation in your state or in the future, and you want to put them on notice within the time periods of your policy to make sure that you're protected if you are going to make a claim. And that is a really worthy exercise of your time, because that's what you've been paying for all this insurance for, right? So now we move on to renewals. If anybody's, everybody has it on a different cycle in general business industries, but so what you really need to do is look at your renewals, see if you've been sent a renewal, and if those renewals are modifying your coverages, right? And that can be negotiated out. If you get a renewal in May and it says that it's excluding pandemic, where before it did not, you really need to go to your broker and make your broker go back to the company and negotiate that out, right? And it's entirely possible that the policy, the insurance company may demand higher premiums for certain types of coverage, but that's all a matter of negotiation. These insurance policies are not what's called adhesion contracts. They can't just impose it on you. It's a contract, and like any other contract, you can negotiate the terms or put it out into the marketplace. I will say, having spoken to an attorney who does exclusively insurance coverage and dealing with insurance carriers, she was saying that the market was already in turmoil, and insurance markets do not like uncertainty. So there's really a lot of tumult in the market, and there has been an uptick in premiums that are charged, but you need to just really look closely and see what's going to work for you. And again, looking at the exclusions and any amendments that they're sending to you in the mail. I do it myself, right? You get these long legalese things in the mail and you just throw it aside for a later day. But it really is worth taking the hour to just sit down with it, call the broker, and go through the language to make sure that you have the right coverage for this moment and this season if you are opening. Okay. So what do you do now in terms of opening? And two of the things that I wanted to touch on were certification and disclaimers and waivers, which I think are two separate things. But these get back to, what are you going to ask the parents to do? And what are your legal contracts with them? What are your terms of agreement with them as campers and as parents? So, and I can say this, one of my children goes to private school. We went back to the contract for private school, and amazingly enough, was in that contract a full exclusion about pandemic, which must have come from an insurance contract or their insurance policy. And that literally said they can hold school wherever they want to hold it. It doesn't matter if it's physically on campus or not. Obviously that doesn't work for camps. So you need to go back to your existing camp contract and look at what it says in terms of indemnification or waivers of negligence or extreme negligence, and see what's in there that could potentially apply to the pandemic situation and the contraction of COVID on your premises. This is not a do-it-yourself project. I know it's tempting. I know a lot of people don't want to pay the legal fees, but it is worth it to sit down and have advice on what the contract says and maybe what you can do in the future. Now, obviously, the camp contracts were signed, way back when people enrolled, probably before December 31st. So to a certain extent, the contract is what it is. But that doesn't mean that in deciding to open, you can't present the parents with an amended contract or an amendment to the contract that says any number of things that you want in terms of your comfort level of opening. Now, there's a question of, should you do that or do you want to do that as a PR component? But from a legal and business standpoint, I think it's important to examine what additional protections do you want from the parent, and that comes in with a disclaimer and waiver, but also what verification of compliance do you want from them? And there's nothing in the guidelines that say that you need to do this, but as a lawyer, and as a business owner myself, I want people, and we're requiring this of visitors to our office. I want verification that, as I said before, nobody in the household that they're living in is symptomatic, that they haven't been engaging in any reckless behavior like going out in crowds without a mask, that they've been sanitizing and washing their hands, any number of things that can go on the wish list. And again, like the Google form that I suggested, whether it's for parents or whether it's for staff, I think you want to have that automated so that you have a record, and also obviously somebody reviewing it, because you don't want somebody to say, well, yeah, I was outside and somebody coughed on me and you didn't pick up on that. But I think it's reasonable to ask parents for that. They want their kids to go to camp, and if they want them to go to camp, they should be willing to verify their own part in it and take ownership of it, right? Because like I said, in this situation, in my view, the burden is not just on you, but I think it's a matter of making that clear to them, documenting it, and reminding them, right? Communication is going to be key this summer like never before. So whether that's, in your social media or your reminders, however you want to shape it in your voice and your branding, certainly reminding them that this isn't just, when the kids get home, they're with the parents and that's it. It doesn't affect camp. It's going to affect camp for the whole summer. And you want to make sure that they know that they have to do their part at home. So moving on to disclaimers and waivers. This is different, right? And there's a different taste in the mouth that it might leave for certain people, and certain people might want not to ask the parents to do this. But I know from my own experience, and actually just going back to the certification part for a second, the camp asks for a social media policy and for the kid to sign on to it and for the parents to sign on to it. And so we're already doing those sorts of things, that after camp contacts and after camp activities and contact tracers in that context. We're really just applying that now to COVID. So that's kind of in the bucket of parent certification and verification. You're just making an amendment to your existing policies and asking them to acknowledge that. With respect to the disclaimers and waivers, again, going back to what your existing camp contract says, right? You can have somebody waive negligence, right? And you've seen this if you've ever gone to a trapeze camp or if you've ever gone rock climbing someplace. They ask you to sign a waiver that says that you're releasing them and indemnifying and defending them from any harm that might befall you from engaging in this adventure activity on their premises. This is similar. You can't have somebody disclaim extreme negligence. And you certainly might not want to have parents sign something like that from a branding standpoint or a marketing standpoint. But with respect to, because the parent's not going to say, yeah, I'm releasing you from, if my kid's unconscious in the pool, God forbid, or something like that. But with respect to COVID, in my view, as a parent and as a lawyer, I don't think it's unreasonable, right? That you have a parent say, I've read what you're going to do, and you've said that you're going to comply with that, or something along those lines. And I understand it could be on a spectrum, right? I understand that you're not guaranteeing that the camp will be free from COVID. I understand there are risks inherent in in enrolling my kid in camp for the summer of 2020. There can be a spectrum of what people want to do as a business owner with respect to their clients, the parents. But I would urge you and invite you to consider doing something like that, certainly to give you peace of mind and let you sleep at night, because that's a big piece of it, right? You can't have the whole camp experience, as different as it will be in 2020, if you're stressing out about what's going to happen, if somebody coughs or sneezes, notwithstanding everything you've been doing in this time period. And again, does the insurance company require it? Now, most insurance companies will, on the application, ask you about certain policies and procedures depending on the nature of the business. But you want to look at what your policy says about that. And certainly on the renewal, or if you're looking to place new insurance, see what are they asking about that in terms of waivers, disclaimers, dissemination of policies, and looking at that. And then the question about, is it legally binding in terms of the disclaimer or waiver? That remains to be seen, but I will tell you that whether or not it is legally binding to the standpoint of precluding a lawsuit, at a minimum, it will show a certain assumption of the risk, that you are disclosing to the parent that they are assuming a certain amount of risk by sending their child to camp, that you are doing your best. This is not in legal language, but that you are doing your best, but that the parents are also, as I said, a co-partner in helping you comply with your policies, and that they are aware of what's going on. I don't know, you might say, well, it's obvious what's going on, but 4 years from now, memories will fade. And it's important to document and memorialize in this moment what was known, what was disclosed, and what the parent understood. And they will sign that to get their kid to camp. And it will be, you don't want it to be that situation. Hopefully you never need to use them. You put it in the camper's file and in your general file, and hopefully you never need to pull it out again. But if you do, you're going to be happy you have that document saying, look, they signed this, right? And the whole idea is, it's not just who's right or wrong at the end of the day, but to prevent the lawsuit in the first place, because you're going to have to pay for legal fees. Maybe your carrier will pay for those legal fees and the cost of defense, but you're going to pay for that eventually in your premium. And again, it's a PR question as well as a liability question. And I invite you to consider them as two separate questions of, would it make you feel better? And what would you like in an ideal world? And then you can scale it back in terms of the messaging and how you're going to present it and how it's going to, be packaged to be as part of your, not an us versus them situation, but really enlisting them to be part of the whole and part of the solution. Okay, so how am I doing on time? I'm going to do just a couple of other things to touch on. So in terms of not opening, I think one of the biggest things that camps have had to face is in terms of their goodwill that they've acquired over decades of a family business, and not being willing to risk it, right? And the liability of feeling that they had a camper who got COVID on their premises. Being on the inside of the industry, you may feel differently about it. But I think in day camps and sleepaway camps, I think it is a different view. And I think the ground has been rapidly changing, right? That what might have seemed just an impossibility and unfathomable back in May about resident camps looks a little bit different today, now that New York is, entering phase 2 in most of the state, I think, or even phase 3. New York City is not quite there yet, but the camps aren't in New York City for the most part. And so, I think whereas in April and May, a lot of resident camps didn't want to risk being the one who got COVID on their shores. And that's something that you face all the time. Unfortunately, kids get meningitis, or they get, Coxsackie diseases, or whatever it is. It's certainly out there. But maybe that might look a little bit different today, is all I'm saying. And it is a travesty that this summer is time that the camps will never get back. And I know a lot of camps have been refinancing the properties that they own, or even just based on the business operations of the camps. And, they're faced with the prospect of having to give refunds and losing that entire year of operating income. And I know from my own experience from other camps that most camps are either, asking parents to roll over their deposits to the next year, or even to wait for the return of the deposits. There's really no right or wrong answer to it. I can only say that depending on what the contract says of what you have.
That's interesting, or you couldn't tell us what are you talking about? I'm not even listening.
Yeah, muted.
It's a lawyer talking.
Hey, Samara, can you mute the other participants? Okay. So, so again, it depends on what your contract says, right? My own private school contract says there's no refunds no matter what. And there's a difference between your obligation to return tuition in terms of whether a parent has chosen not to send their camper, even if you open, or if you're choosing not to open and giving it back. It is, again, it's a two-part analysis. It's a matter of contract and what your contract says. And then I think what I'm seeing universally in the camp industry is what you should do. And I think most camps that I've heard from, or a lot of them, have been giving back the refunds. I've heard of one camp, phasing the refunds over that, over a period of time to defray some of the cash flow issues. So again, there's really no right or wrong answer here, but I think the issue of not to open is really one focused on when are you giving, are you going to give the refunds and how much, when are you going to give them? And it's really more of than a hunkering down for the next year in terms of focusing and using this time on shoring up your own policies, contemplating for next year, maybe even modifying the facilities, to I guess adjust for what we've learned so far in this environment. Okay, so by now your head is probably swimming. I hope most of it was understandable. But I would just say that some of the other things that came to mind is rethinking immunization requirements. We're so focused on COVID. There was an article in the Times a week or so ago that people aren't bringing their kids into the pediatrician. Measles is going to have a resurgence. We don't really have to worry about lice in the time of social distancing, so I'm thrilled about that. But you do have to worry about these other communicable diseases for which there are immunizations. And I think it's important not to lose sight of that. It's not minutia. And again, this is dependent on state law. You have to speak with your counsel about it, about what you can do. I know there are certain religious exemptions. Obviously, there was some movement on that with the measles outbreak last year, but you should, if you are inclined to do so, look at whether or not you want to require all immunizations on the schedule before children are coming to camp, because the last thing you want, as everybody's focused on COVID, is you emerge from 2020 COVID-free, but you have measles, or you have SARS, or bird flu. Those are not things that you want to be, while you're focusing over here, you're forgetting about what's over here. Again, for compliance, I think one thing that we're looking at for our office, obviously a very different business model, is having a COVID-specific committee, having one person who's focused only on the COVID things. I know there's a temptation to wrap responsibilities into the people you have to cut down on employment costs. But in this situation, from a liability and just operation standpoint, I really think it's important to have one person focused on this specific situation. Yes, it could be in part a nurse, but a nurse and the medical staff is really dealing with the day-to-day things that are going to happen anyway. Kids are still going to get scrapes, and they're still going to have to deal with medical attention. So I would consider adding that into the repertoire of somebody who is responsible for ensuring compliance, reviewing those Google forms, and the like. Again, some people have suggested camp consultants for this purpose, and contact tracers. The COVID-specific monitor could take care of this, depending on what the population is going to be at your camp, if you're reducing it by 50% or so on. But you want to make sure that if that child in group A or B has a fever or has some sort of a symptom, that you're going to be able to trace and make it easier for yourself who they had contact with in camp, how you're going to isolate them until you can get them home, but also what you're going to do from there in terms of bringing the parent in and having them do their own tracing. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. So with that, I will open it up to questions if anybody has them.
Yeah, I have 5 coming at you. I'm sure more will come in. Thank you so much, Alison. That was really great. I think you bridged the gap of legalese and making it easy for us to understand. So thank you. I speak on behalf of the group. The first question is from Denise. It's about a specific part of the New York guidelines. So I'll say the part and then the question. There was a part specifically about the screening questionnaire. Daily temperature checks may also be conducted per U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission or DOH guidelines. Responsible parties are prohibited from keeping record of employee health data, e.g. temperature data. So with that being said, Denise was curious, if you're not allowed to keep the data, how are you going back to prove that you were taking the data?
So I think sufficient with, I'm a big fan of checklists. So I don't think you have to record what the temperature was for an individual employee. I think you just need a record that the employee who is taking the thermal scan actually did it. So I really like, kind of like in the restrooms when you go to a restaurant, there's like a checklist of when it was last inspected. I envision a lot of those. Person's got the clipboard, they're doing it, they're handing it in to a supervisor who's initialing it. That, the person who's doing the thermal scanning probably just needs to have a checklist of, I made sure that I scanned every person who came through, that, that I followed, like, okay, if person has above, I think it's 100.3, I brought them over to this isolated part. It went over to this person. They took their temperature, separately. We followed procedures to send them home. I don't think you need to record the actual data. And I've seen different types of thermal scanners. Believe it or not, we have a beach club, and the beach club has been opened, and it really did give me an insight of how it can work. They hired an entire security staff to do it. They had one scanner that required you stand there and it took the snapshot, and it was taking too long in terms of getting people in. I mean, I don't know how much they spent on it, but they invested in a different thermal scanner that's like a rolling one, that it just trains on the person, somebody's behind it. All that person needs to do is just initial on each day that they did it, they manned it, they're certifying that nobody snuck through, and that they did what they were supposed to do about, segregating them if the alarm went off.
Great.
So.
Thank you.
Sure.
And for the question askers, if you aren't getting exactly, if I'm paraphrasing incorrectly, or if you need clarification, please feel free to chat again. I know it's hard when someone else is asking a question on your behalf. Next, Robin asked, and this was pursuant to the conversation you were having about insurance coverage. If you renewed in January, and you found out through this that there is no coverage for communicable disease, damage, lawsuits, etc., is it too late to negotiate now?
No, because you can call your broker and tell them that you want to place that coverage, and then they'll do an amendment to the policy. What it's going to cost is a little bit different, but in this type of situation, I think it's worth it. You're going to look at your deductible, but the part that I don't know, and I couldn't really get clarity on, is what products the companies are placing or offering. I would imagine that the premiums are going to be high, but it's definitely worth it to ask and find out. So it's definitely not too late to place that coverage for specifically for this pandemic, communicable diseases, airborne pathogens, and see if your broker is just going to price it out, which they should.
Cool. Thank you. This one's a little bit more specific from Jeff. So do you have any sample language for a COVID attendance waiver, or any feedback or specific things that you think that camps should be looking for to add?
So I don't have any sample language that I could share. That we're talking about liability, so that deals with my own liability of sending out language and things like that. But off the cuff of what I was kind of riffing about, I wouldn't do this as a do-it-yourself, but to the extent that you already have a lawyer who did indemnification, well, it's really not indemnification, but waivers in your existing contracts, it's a matter of just updating it to include, COVID and things like that. So, and I know what a lot of people do, sometimes when they retain me, they'll draft it out and then I kind of edit it and do that. Obviously everybody's sensitive to cost, but it is important to do it by the book, and that way, you have it done. So.
Awesome, thank you. Holly wanted to know, would you recommend that staff also sign a waiver, not just camp families?
So for staff, it's a little bit different. For staff, you have an obligation under OSHA to provide a safe working environment. And that has been a mantra that I've been operating under in terms of, what does a safe working environment mean in a time of COVID, right? And your employees really can't waive that away, right? And you also don't want to necessarily put something in writing with your employees because you want to make sure that they are at-will employees. I know it's a little bit different for seasonal employees, and I dabble in employment issues, but I usually bring in my employment partner. And so I don't think that you want to have them waive anything. I do think it's fair to have them certify about their risk level and that they're complying with the guidelines. That I don't see as an employment issue at all, but the waiver is probably not going to fly.
Awesome. Thank you. And the last question, unless someone asks more, from Wendy. In general, do you feel a waiver of liability is sufficient, or would you also include an indemnity clause?
Well, the indemnity is kind of like, if I'm liable to you, you're liable back to me. So and usually you're not going to get a parent who's doing that. I mean, usually the indemnity is, if I cause damage to your property, I'm agreeing to indemnify you from other claims and things like that. I said I was going to talk about vendors. With vendors, they're probably not going to give you an indemnity, but it is something that you want to talk about with them in terms of their coming onto the premises and your contracts with them, which I would also look at in terms of when you're looking at your contracts for this summer, who's delivering the food, who's delivering the sports equipment, what are they doing, and are they going to give you the same confirmation that they haven't been engaging in risk tolerance for that. So I think the key things, if I had to rank them in order of importance, I would say you want confirmation of compliance from the parents. You probably want some waiver, whether that is a waiver of liability or at least something to confirm the assumption of the risk of camp in 2020. And the indemnification is a nice to have, but it's not likely to have for that. So.
Got it. Do you have reciprocity to Massachusetts? Someone just asked. I'm joking. I told them.
I'm admitted in Massachusetts. I'm retired, but my partner's admitted in Massachusetts, okay. So we do have that.
So feel free to email Alison directly.
By the way,
I was just proud that I knew the word reciprocity off the top of my head.
So. That's pretty good. That's now if you could spell it, you're going to get bonus points.
Nope, Googled that. Nope.
I was going to say that is what I used to look like on the screen before COVID, and so maybe one day when I can get my nails done, my hair done, like that.
This is different world. That was really great, Alison. I learned a few things, so thank you for that. And I'll give anyone another minute if anyone has any other questions in the chat, and if not, we'll say thank you.
I must have answered everything. Wait, I will. I can come off with. Oh, I'm sorry, I should have come off of the.
It's all good. You're perfect. Okay, it looks like that's it. So thank you so much, Alison. We have recorded this, so we will post it on our website. The chat is saying thank you a lot. And if anyone would like to be connected with Alison, just email our office and we can get you guys set up. Great. Be well and have a good rest of the day. Thanks again, Alison.
Take care. Have a good day.